8 million people visit Niagara Falls every year, and nearly all of them leave the same way, across the Rainbow Bridge, into Canada, where the hotels are tall, the casinos are lit, and the restaurants stay open past 9. On the American side, the city of Niagara Falls, New York, peaked at 102,394 residents in 1960. Today it holds fewer than 48,000. A quarter of them live below the poverty line. The most famous waterfall in the Western Hemisphere thunders away, day and night, 600,000 gallons per second, indifferent to the fact that the city built beside it is half empty. The water doesn't care. It never did. And that, in a way, is the whole story. Because for 200 years, everybody who came to Niagara Falls wanted something from that water, and the water just kept falling. The first people who wanted something were honeymooners. In the summer of 1801, Theodosia Burr, the brilliant 18-year-old daughter of Vice President Aaron Burr, arrived at the falls with her new husband, Joseph Alston, a South Carolina plantation owner who would later become governor. They traveled by pack horse from Albany with a retinue of servants across frontier roads that barely existed to stand at the edge of the gorge and feel the mist on their faces. 3 years later, Jerome Bonaparte, the youngest brother of Napoleon himself, brought his Baltimore bride, Elizabeth Patterson, all the way from New Orleans by stagecoach. The trip took weeks. The story made every newspaper in the country. If Napoleon's brother honeymooned at Niagara Falls, then clearly this was where civilized people went after their weddings. Within a generation, Niagara and honeymoon were practically synonyms. By the early 1900s, local boosters had officially branded the phrase, Niagara Falls was the honeymoon capital of the world, and businesses sprang up to service the claim. Heart-shaped bathtubs, honeymoon suites with champagne service, tourist shops selling miniature barrels and postcards of the mist. In 1953, the connection was cemented in the national imagination when 20th Century Fox released a Technicolor thriller called Niagara, starring Marilyn Monroe. The poster depicted Monroe superimposed against the falls, as though she and the cataract were the same force of nature. The film was shot on location. Half a century later, you could still find the poster in souvenir shops on both sides of the border. By the 1820s, hotels were already crowding the riverbank. The most famous was the Cataract House, which started life in 1825 as a converted mill, a 3-story oak log building on the corner of Main Street and the river. General Parkhurst Whitney bought it in 1831 and spent the next 2 decades expanding it into a 5-story palace that occupied an entire city block, complete with balconies overlooking the rapids, a ballroom added in 1853, and a drawing room with what local papers called a magnificent piazza offering a superb view. By 1848, a Niagara Falls newspaper called the Cataract House the immense pile of stone and mortar that ranked with the best class of hotels in the Union. Presidents stayed there. European royalty stayed there. Businessmen and tourists and honeymooners filled it every summer. In 1881, they installed electric light on the veranda, one of the first hotels in the country to do so. The Cataract House was, for a long stretch of the 19th century, one of the most celebrated hotels in America. It was also something else, something the tourist brochures never mentioned. The Cataract House sat on the Niagara River, and on the other side of that river was Canada. And in Canada, slavery was illegal. Through the 1840s and 1850s, the hotel employed dozens of African American waiters, many of them born in the South. Under the leadership of head waiter John Morrison, these men quietly helped enslaved people who had been brought north by their slaveholding owners escape across the river to freedom. The Cataract House was, simultaneously, a luxury resort for Southern plantation families and one of the most important nodes on the Underground Railroad. In 1850, more than 80% of the African Americans working at the hotel listed their birthplaces as a Southern state. The waiters served dinner to slaveholders at night and smuggled their human property to freedom by morning. The building that symbolized American leisure also harbored American liberation, and nobody staying in the honeymoon suite needed to know. But there was something else happening on that riverbank, something less romantic. Mills and factories crowded the shoreline, harnessing the rapids to turn wheels and power machinery. Fences went up. Entrepreneurs bought parcels of land with views of the falls and charged visitors exorbitant fees just to glimpse the water. By the time the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted visited in August of 1869, he was shocked. The man who had designed Central Park found the American side of Niagara Falls walled off by brickworks, smokestacks, and industrial clutter. Goat Island, the wooded patch of land between the American and Horseshoe Falls, was practically the only ground not covered in industry. Olmsted joined a scrappy group of early conservationists called the Free Niagara Movement, and for more than 15 years they lobbied, published, testified, and pressured the New York State Legislature to buy the land back from private interests and open it to the public. In 1885, Governor David Hill signed the Niagara Appropriations Bill, creating the Niagara Reservation, the first state park in the United States. Olmsted and his partner Calvert Vaux designed the grounds, clearing factories, laying footpaths through wooded areas, and opening views to the rapids that had been hidden behind fences for decades. The idea was radical. Nature's most magnificent spectacle should belong to everyone, not to whoever got there first with $1 and a fence post. It was a beautiful victory, and within 10 years it would be almost beside the point, because what happened next changed everything, not just for Niagara Falls, but arguably for the world. In 1891, a young scientist named Edward Goodrich Acheson, raised in the coal fields of southwestern Pennsylvania, self-educated after dropping out of school at 16 to support his family, was trying to create artificial diamonds in his workshop using electricity. He had worked for Thomas Edison and struck out on his own. He failed at diamonds, but discovered something nearly as hard: tiny, shining crystals of silicon carbide, the world's first artificially produced mineral. He called it Carborundum, a name based on a misunderstanding of its chemistry, believing he had combined carbon with corundum, and he liked the sound of it enough to keep it. Acheson formed the Carborundum Company that same year, raised $150,000 from local investors at $100 per share, and secured a $7,000 contract with George Westinghouse for grinding wheels. But his factory in Pennsylvania couldn't produce enough. He needed far more electricity than his little 134 horsepower dynamo could supply. He needed Niagara Falls. And Niagara Falls was about to have electricity to spare. As a boy growing up in what is now Croatia, Nikola Tesla had seen a photograph of the falls and dreamed of putting a wheel beneath them. By 1893, that dream had become a contract. George Westinghouse won the bid to build a hydroelectric power station using Tesla's alternating current system, beating out Thomas Edison's competing direct current design. The project was backed by J.P. Morgan and W.K. Vanderbilt. Construction took 3 years. On November 16, 1896, the switch was thrown, and for the first time in history, electricity generated at Niagara Falls surged through wires all the way to Buffalo, 26 miles away. The Niagara Falls Gazette reported with pardonable exaggeration that the switch caused the Niagara River to flow uphill. Tesla himself called the power station a monument worthy of our scientific age. The Carborundum Company had already arrived the year before, opening its new plant in October 1895. It was one of the first companies to sign a long-term contract with the Niagara Falls Power Company. By 1896, it was producing 1 million pounds of silicon carbide a year. By 1910, 10 million pounds. Within 2 decades, it was supplying the world with enough abrasive material to influence entire industries: steel, automotive, jewelry, metallurgy. But Carborundum was only the beginning. The cheap, seemingly limitless electricity pouring out of the gorge attracted companies the way a lamp attracts moths. The Niagara Electrochemical Company arrived in 1896 to produce chlorine. The Matheson Alkali Company started making synthetic ammonia. The British-owned Oldbury Electrochemical Company set up shop manufacturing phosphorus and caustic potash. Reusler and Haslacher came for hydrogen peroxide and metal cyanides. In 1903, a man named Elon Hooker founded the Hooker Electrochemical Company, which would become one of the largest producers of caustic soda and chlorine in the country. DuPont would eventually absorb several of the earlier firms, running its Niagara plant for decades. The pattern was clear, and it was irresistible. The falls produced cheap electricity. Cheap electricity powered electrochemical processes that required enormous amounts of energy. Those processes produced the building blocks of modern industry: chlorine for bleach and water treatment, caustic soda for soap and paper, abrasives for every factory floor in America. The companies needed to be close to the power source, so they built their plants in Niagara Falls. The plants needed workers, so the workers came by the thousands. The workers needed houses, stores, schools, churches. A city grew, not because of the waterfall's beauty, but because of its kilowatts. Tourism was, in the local phrase, a secondary niche. Manufacturing was the real business. And for a while, it worked magnificently. Paper, rubber, plastics, petrochemicals, carbon insulators, abrasives, metallurgical products. The list of what Niagara Falls factories produced reads like an index of 20th century industrial civilization. By 1970, Niagara County alone had 9 major chemical-producing companies employing over 5,000 people, and that was after the decline had already started. The population doubled and doubled again, from 19,457 in 1900 to 50,760 in 1920 to 75,460 in 1930. The growth rate in the 1890s was over 13% per year, one of the fastest in the state. The city incorporated on March 17, 1892, St. Patrick's Day, because Thomas Vincent Welch, the state assemblyman who pushed the bill through, was a second-generation Irish-American with a flair for symbolism. Falls Street, the main commercial thoroughfare running from downtown toward the state park, was lined with restaurants, theaters, department stores, and small shops. The Strand Theater and the Cataract Theater were ornate, velvet-seated picture palaces where you could see the latest Hollywood features for a quarter. You could buy shoes at Howard's, browse the multiple floors of Jentz's department store, shop at the old Beers store, which had a tunnel running under the street to a building across the way, or eat at any of a dozen small restaurants before catching a show. The city had its own daily newspaper, the Niagara Gazette, founded in 1854. It had ball teams, fraternal lodges, Italian social clubs in Little Italy, and church steeples that marked the skyline alongside the smokestacks. On summer evenings, the sidewalks were thick with families walking toward the mist. The trolley ran down Fall Street on embedded rails, and the streetlights were handsome cast-iron fixtures. A postcard from around 1917 shows automobiles proceeding down a well-paved Fall Street, the trolley tracks gleaming, the buildings solid and confident on both sides. It looks like a city that expects to be there forever, but there was a shadow in all of this, and it had been there from the start. In the 1890s, an entrepreneur named William T. Love had a vision. He would build a model industrial city near the falls, centered on a canal connecting the upper and lower Niagara River. The canal would provide both shipping and hydropower. Love started digging. He dug about a mile of trench, 60 feet wide, 3,000 feet long. And then 2 things happened. The economy collapsed in the panic of 1893, and Nikola Tesla invented alternating current, which could transmit electricity over long distances by wire, which meant factories no longer needed to sit right next to the waterfall. Love's model city died. His canal was never finished. For decades it sat there, a half-mile-long ditch. Local kids used it as a swimming hole in summer. Remember that ditch? We'll come back to it. The city kept growing through the 1940s. Hooker Chemical, by now one of the major employers, ramped up production during World War II, manufacturing chemicals used in synthetic rubber and even contributing materials to the Manhattan Project. The war effort demanded chlorine, caustic soda, and dozens of specialty chemicals, and Niagara Falls had the capacity to produce all of them. The population hit 90,872 in 1950 and crested at 102,394 in 1960, the highest it would ever be. That year, Niagara Falls was one of the biggest cities in upstate New York. Nearly every family in the city had a connection to the plants. The factories hummed around the clock. The union jobs paid well, offered pensions, guaranteed raises. If you were a young man in Niagara Falls in 1955, you expected to work at Hooker or Carborundum or DuPont for 30 years, retire with a pension, and die in the house you'd bought on a tree-lined street within walking distance of the gorge. The falls were background noise, literally. You could hear the low, constant thunder from your front porch, the way people near an airport stop hearing the planes. The waterfall was not the point of living in Niagara Falls. The paycheck was the point. The waterfall was just the reason the paycheck existed. One of the problems that would surface later, when the factories started to close, was that people who had spent generations in union jobs, good, secure, well-paying union jobs, were not easily persuaded to settle for the service industry work that replaced them. A man who earned a living wage making chemicals did not want to earn minimum wage parking cars for tourists. This was not laziness. It was the vertigo of a world being yanked out from under you. As far back as anyone in Niagara Falls could remember, there had been real jobs, the kind of jobs that let you buy a house and raise a family and look your neighbors in the eye. When those jobs vanished, something more than employment disappeared. A whole way of understanding what the city was for disappeared with it. And then, on the afternoon of June 7th, 1956, the Niagara Gorge reminded everyone who was actually in charge. The Schoellkopf power station was a sprawling complex built into the gorge wall just downstream of the American Falls. Constructed in 3 phases between 1905 and 1924, it had been, upon completion, the largest hydroelectric power station in the world. Water was diverted from the Niagara River above the falls through a canal that ran 4,600 feet through the city to the edge of the gorge, then dropped to turbine generator stations at the base. Workers noticed water seeping through the back wall that morning. By mid-afternoon, the cracks were widening. 40 men piled sandbags against the retaining wall, trying to hold it. Just before 5 o'clock, Richard Draper, a 39-year-old maintenance foreman, telephoned his wife in Lewiston. He told her they were having problems with water seepage. He said the ceiling was falling in and the floor was buckling. He didn't know when he'd be home. Minutes after he hung up, over 100,000 tons of rock slid from the gorge wall into the power station. 2/3 of the plant collapsed into the Niagara River. 6 generators capable of producing 322,500 horsepower were demolished in seconds. Debris flew across the gorge to the Canadian side. Damage was estimated at $100 million. 400,000 kilowatts of power vanished from the grid in an instant. Richard Draper shouted for his men to get out. 40 of them did. 2 were picked up by a Canadian maid of the mist boat in the river below. Draper didn't make it. His body was swept into the current. He was the only fatality that afternoon because he stayed long enough to make sure everyone else got clear. The Schoellkopf collapse wasn't just a disaster, it was a hinge. It prompted the passage of the Niagara Redevelopment Act of 1957 and brought Robert Moses, New York's legendary and ruthless master builder, to the Niagara frontier. Moses oversaw the construction of a massive new power plant in Lewiston, 4.5 miles downstream. The Robert Moses Niagara Power Plant opened in 1961 and was, for a time, the largest hydroelectric facility in the Western world. President Kennedy called it an example to the world. It could produce 2.6 million kilowatts, enough to power most of upstate New York and much of New York City. But Moses didn't just build a power plant, he built a highway. The Robert Moses State Parkway, opened in 1964, was a 4-lane limited-access road running along the Niagara River Gorge. Moses envisioned it as a scenic drive, and for motorists it was. The views of the gorge were spectacular. The problem was what the parkway did to everything behind it. The highway cut directly between the city and the river, severing neighborhoods from the waterfront with guardrails and chain-link fences. Residents who had once walked to the gorge rim now faced a roaring wall of traffic. The parkway funneled tourists from the interstate directly to the state park and then across the Rainbow Bridge into Canada, bypassing downtown Niagara Falls entirely. A visitor could drive in from Buffalo, see the waterfall, and leave the country without ever stopping at a single Niagara Falls business. It was, in the words of Congressman Brian Higgins decades later, a barrier between Niagara Falls neighborhoods and arguably the most magnificent waterfront in the world. Moses's Parkway was one wound. Urban renewal was another. By the early 1960s, Falls Street, the old heart of downtown, the street that had connected the city to the waterfall since the 1820s, was showing its age. Some called it vibrant. The New York Times called it a seedy honky-tonk. The city, under Mayor E. Dent Lackey, a fire and brimstone former Methodist minister, chose the solution that hundreds of American cities chose in that era: demolition. The 1965 urban renewal plan called for tearing down the old blocks of Falls Street, The small restaurants, the ornate theaters, the shoe stores and department stores and mom-and-pop shops, and replacing them with something modern, something big, something that would announce Niagara Falls had entered the future. Federal money poured in. The bulldozers arrived. Block after block came down. Jefferson Avenue gone. Erie Avenue gone. The streetscape that had taken a century to build was flattened in a few years. What rose in its place was a series of structures that, one by one, failed. The Niagara Falls Convention and Civic Center opened on January 12, 1974, designed by Philip Johnson, one of the most famous architects in the country. Its arch design was supposedly inspired by the rainbows commonly seen over the falls. Locals thought it looked like a Quonset hut. The 10,000-seat arena was planted directly in the middle of what had been Falls Street, blocking the old pedestrian route from downtown to the State Park and eliminating two main thoroughfares. The convention center was built, but nothing was built around it to support it. No restaurants, no shops, no critical mass of businesses that would give people a reason to linger. A visitor attending a convention had to book a hotel room in Niagara Falls, Ontario, or in Buffalo, 20 miles away. The building was, in the parlance of urban planning, a destination without a district. It hosted Niagara University basketball games and the occasional concert. It never came close to filling its potential. Then came the Rainbow Center, an enclosed outlet mall designed to compete with the suburban shopping centers that had drained Main Street of its retail trade. The Summit Park Mall, opened in nearby Wheatfield, had already helped kill Main Street shopping. The theory behind Rainbow Center was straightforward enough. If you can't beat the mall, become a mall. Attached to it was Caesar Pelle's Winter Garden, a soaring glass atrium with catwalks through tropical plants, opened in 1977, which was, by all accounts, a striking piece of architecture. It also cut directly across what remained of Falls Street, severing the last visual connection between downtown and the waterfall. The mall struggled. The developers of the Mall of America briefly considered building a mega complex called Fantasyland in Niagara Falls, then backed away. By the late 1990s, the Rainbow Center was nearly empty. It closed in 2000. The city had spent decades and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to replace its downtown, and it had ended up with a convention center nobody could fill, a mall nobody shopped at, and a glass atrium full of tropical plants standing in a city where winter lasts 5 months. As Mayor Paul Dister would later say, with the blunt exhaustion of a man surveying rubble, we had a big pile of federal money and used it to build a big pile of useless crap. But the worst was yet to come, and it came from William Love's ditch. Between 1942 and 1953, the Hooker Chemical Company, the same firm that had been producing chlorine and caustic soda in Niagara Falls since 1903, used Love's abandoned canal as a dump for chemical waste. 21,800 tons of it, chlorinated hydrocarbons, processed sludges, pesticides, dioxin, some of it in 55-gallon drums, some of it dumped loose. When the canal was full, Hooker capped it with clay. In 1953, the company sold the land to the Niagara Falls Board of Education for $1. The deed included a warning about the buried chemicals and an attempt to disclaim future liability. The board built 2 elementary schools on the property. An entire working-class neighborhood of 800 houses grew up around it. Children played in the fields. Families planted gardens. For 25 years, nobody talked much about what was underneath. Then the rains came. Heavy precipitation in the mid-1970s raised the water table, and the clay cap that Hooker had laid over the canal began to fail. Chemicals seeped into basements. Black sludge pooled in backyards. Noxious fumes filled homes. In 1958, the Niagara Falls Health Department had actually seen the first signs of trouble, children experiencing chemical burns from exposed waste on the site, but took no action. 20 years later, the scale of the disaster was becoming impossible to ignore. A reporter named Michael Brown from the Niagara Gazette started investigating, methodically documenting the chemicals and their effects. A 27-year-old housewife named Lois Gibbs, who had moved to the neighborhood with no particular interest in activism, started knocking on doors. Her son attended the 99th Street School, which sat directly over the canal, with 400 students. What she found, going house by house, was horrifying. Miscarriages, birth defects, leukemia, respiratory disease, epilepsy, chromosomal damage at abnormally high rates. In 1978, the state of New York detected toxic chemicals leaching into homes across the neighborhood. President Jimmy Carter issued an emergency declaration, the first ever issued for a non-natural disaster in American history. He would issue a second in 1980. 833 families were eventually relocated. Homes were razed. The canal was capped again and fenced off. The 99th Street School was demolished. Lois Gibbs, the housewife who had started with a clipboard and a list of her neighbors' illnesses, had become the face of an entirely new kind of American activism, the environmental justice movement, born not in a courtroom or a college, but on a poisoned street where kids used to ride their bikes. The lawsuits lasted for years. 1,300 former residents eventually settled for $20 million against Occidental Chemical, which had acquired Hooker in the late 1960s. Occidental later paid $98 million to New York State and another $129 million to the federal government. Love Canal became the most infamous toxic waste site in American history and the direct catalyst for the Superfund Act of 1980, which forced the cleanup of hazardous waste sites across the country. And it buried Niagara Falls under a reputation that no tourism campaign could wash away. The city wasn't just declining, it was poisoned. The very chemicals that the cheap hydroelectric power had attracted had literally seeped into the ground beneath people's homes. The power that built the city had also built the thing that would define it. And Love Canal wasn't even the only dump. Hooker continued disposing of chemical waste at the Hyde Park landfill just down the road from 1953 to 1975. Another 72,000 tons, 4 times more than Love Canal. Niagara County had roughly 100 chemical dump sites in total. The city's entire industrial history was buried just beneath the surface. While all of this was happening, the factories closing, the downtown demolished, the neighborhoods poisoned, the falls kept falling. Tourists still came, 8 million a year to the state park. But something strange had happened to the geography of tourism at Niagara Falls. And to understand it, you only need to stand on the American side and look across the gorge. What you see on the Canadian side is a skyline, the Skylon Tower rising 775 feet. The Falls View Casino Resort, a billion-dollar complex opened in 2004 with 200,000 square feet of gaming floor and a hotel overlooking the Horseshoe Falls. Next to it, Casino Niagara, which has been operating since 1996. Hotels, dozens of them, rising in clusters along the gorge rim. Restaurants, wax museums, haunted houses, a Ferris wheel, an IMAX theater, wine tour operators shuttling visitors to the Niagara-on-the-Lake vineyards. It is garish in places, unabashedly designed to extract money from tourists, but it works. The city of Niagara Falls, Ontario, has a population of 94,000 and growing. Now turn around and look at what you're standing on. The American side has the state park, still free, still beautiful, still designed by Olmsted. And beyond the park, very little. Parking lots, a handful of hotels, some of them in neighborhoods you wouldn't walk through after dark. A Sheraton that locals described as being in a not-so-nice area. Empty storefronts, vacant lots where Fall Street used to be. What the Canadian side understood decades ago is simple. People who travel to see a waterfall want to eat dinner, sleep in a hotel, and spend money within sight of that waterfall. The Canadians built the infrastructure for that. The Americans, having demolished theirs, spent 60 years trying to figure out what went wrong. The Canadians also benefit from geography. From the Ontario side, you face the falls head-on, with an unobstructed panoramic view of both the American and Horseshoe Falls. From the American side, you look at the falls from the side, or from behind, which is dramatic in its own way, but doesn't photograph as well. Nature gave Canada the better view. Human beings gave Canada the better planning. The combination was decisive. Instead, the Americans built a highway that routed tourists past the city, demolished the downtown, replaced it with structures that failed, and then wondered why visitors crossed the bridge. By the 1990s, the American side of Niagara Falls had become a case study in urban planning failure, cited in textbooks alongside Newark and Gary and East St. Louis. The convention center sat mostly empty. The mall was dead. Falls Street, or what the city now called Old Falls Street, was a ghost. The residential neighborhoods beyond downtown were cratered with vacant lots and boarded-up houses. Arson was, in the words of one observer, a popular pastime. The population, which had been hemorrhaging since 1960, showed no sign of stopping. 71,384 in 1980, 61,840 in 1990, 55,593 in 2000, 50,193 in 2010. Each census brought the same grim subtraction. There was also the matter of governance. In 2001, the leadership of Laborers Local 91 was found guilty of extortion, racketeering, and other crimes. The union had been controlled by organized crime for years. Union boss Michael Quarzini died before trial. The rest went to prison. In 2010, former Mayor Vincenzo Anello was indicted on federal corruption charges, accused of accepting $40,000 in loans from a businessman who was later awarded a no-bid lease on city property. He pleaded guilty to unrelated pension fraud and was sentenced to over a year in prison. That same year, the state attorney general intervened in the Niagara Falls Police Department over claims of excessive force and misconduct. Bloomberg Businessweek ran a story about the city's decline that was read across the country. The reputation accumulated like silt. On New Year's Eve, 2002, the city tried a Hail Mary. The Seneca Nation of Indians, authorized by Governor George Pataki, converted the hulking, largely useless convention center into Seneca Niagara Casino. The transformation cost $80 million and took 100 days. The same Philip Johnson building that had killed Fall Street was gutted and reborn as a gaming floor with 82,000 square feet of slot machines and table games. 3 years later, a 26-story hotel tower went up next to it, the largest hotel in New York State outside Manhattan, at a cost of $240 million. The New York Times described the tower as the skyline on the American side of the Niagara River. It was, in a sense, the American answer to the Canadian casino sprawl across the gorge. And the casino has, to a degree, delivered. It employs roughly 1,500 people. Since its opening, the Seneca Nation has contributed more than $1 billion to New York State in gaming revenues. But the broader promise that the casino would trigger a cascade of new hotels, restaurants, and attractions, that it would catalyze the rebirth of downtown, has remained largely unfulfilled. The casino functions as a self-contained world. Visitors drive in, park in the garage, gamble, eat at the in-house restaurants, sleep in the tower, and leave. The surrounding blocks remain largely empty, the old dream that tourists would spill out of the casino and into a vibrant downtown required a vibrant downtown to spill into, and that downtown had been bulldozed 40 years earlier. There is a particular cruelty in the arithmetic of Niagara Falls, New York. The city sits adjacent to a natural wonder that draws 8 million visitors a year. It possesses the oldest state park in the United States, designed by the man who designed Central Park. It is the site where alternating current proved itself to the world, where the modern electrical grid was born. It is the place where a young Croatian immigrant's childhood dream, a wheel beneath the waterfall, became the foundation of the electrified 20th century. These are not small things, and yet the city has lost more than half its population. About 60% of residents, as of a few years ago, received some form of public assistance. The median household income hovers around $36,000. The unemployment rate runs roughly double the national average. Housing units built before 1940 make up nearly half the housing stock. The city has been fighting to stay above 50,000 residents, a threshold below which it could lose its official city status and the federal funding that comes with it. That fight, by recent census counts, appears to be lost. The irony that organizes the whole story is not hard to see. Niagara Falls had two gifts, beauty and power. The beauty came from the waterfall itself, the sheer spectacle of 600,000 gallons per second plunging into a gorge, the mist rising like smoke, the rainbows hanging in the air. The power came from the same water, harnessed through turbines and generators into the cheap electricity that built the modern world. The city had to choose which gift to build around. At every critical juncture, it chose power. It chose the factories over the tourists. It chose the chemicals over the clean water. It chose the highway over the waterfront. It chose the convention center over the commercial street. And when the factories left, and the chemicals surfaced, and the highway emptied, and the convention center failed, the city found that it had spent a century building everything except the one thing it could never lose, a reason for people to linger beside something beautiful. There is a footnote to this story, and it is happening now. In 2020, after 30 years of citizen agitation and public debate, the Robert Moses Parkway, the highway that had walled the city off from the gorge since the 1960s, was finally torn out. The 2-mile section within the city limits was demolished and replaced with green space, walking trails, and scenic overlooks. The $42 million project was described as the largest expansion of green space since the Niagara Reservation was designed in 1885. Olmsted's vision, in a sense, is being extended. The fences are coming down again, a century and a half later. Whirlpool Street was rebuilt as a complete street, reconnecting pedestrians and bicyclists to the gorge rim. A private developer purchased 38 parcels on and near Main Street, saying the deal wouldn't have happened if the parkway were still there. There are new hotels under construction, new restaurants opening, a culinary institute for Niagara County Community College now occupying the old Rainbow Center Mall. Old Falls Street has been redesigned as a public gathering space, with a square called Cataract Commons that opened in 2020. Named, whether anyone notices or not, after the Grand Hotel that burned down in 1945, the one where waiters smuggled enslaved people to freedom while serving dinner to their owners. It is possible that these efforts will, over time, bring the city back toward something livable. It is also possible that they are too late, that the damage of 6 decades, the demolished downtown, the poisoned ground, the lost population, the squandered reputation, is not the kind of thing that a bike path and a culinary institute can fix. The Canadian side has a 60-year head start in building the tourist infrastructure the American side is only now attempting. And the latest blow came recently. In 2025, cross-border traffic from Canada dropped by 20% amid political tensions, tariffs, and a weakening Canadian dollar, draining a major source of visitors from the American side. What remains, and what has always remained, is the water. 600,000 gallons per second, drawn from 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, Erie, Huron, Michigan, Superior, funneling through the Niagara River and dropping 170 feet into the gorge below, 3,160 tons every second. The mist rises 200 feet in the air. You can feel it on your face from a quarter mile away. Rainbows appear and disappear in the spray, sometimes 2 or 3 stacked on top of one another. At night, the falls are lit in shifting colors, a tradition that goes back to Tesla's original vision of illuminating the water with the power it produced. The Cataract House is gone. Burned to the ground in 1945, its site now a small park near the Red Coach Inn. Falls Street is gone, bulldozed in the name of progress that never arrived. The Schoellkopf power station is rubble in the gorge. You can ride an elevator down to walk among its ruins, and the Maid of the Mist, which has been carrying tourists into the spray since 1846, now stores its boats on the very spot where the generators once stood. The convention center is a casino. The mall is a cooking school. The highway is a hiking trail. The chemical plants are Superfund sites. The neighborhoods are half vacant. The school that sat on Love Canal was demolished decades ago. But you can still stand on the gorge rim in the spot where Olmsted stood in 1869 and look out across the water. The American Falls are to your left, a broad curtain of white dropping straight down over a ledge of dolostone. The Bridal Veil Falls are just beyond, separated by a thin sliver of Luna Island. And to your right, the Horseshoe Falls curve away toward Canada in a shape so perfect it seems deliberate, the water green and smooth at the lip before it shatters into white chaos below. The sound is enormous and constant, not a roar exactly, but a deep, saturating hum that fills your chest, and the mist drifts over you, and for a moment the city behind you, the empty lots, the boarded windows, the casino tower, all of it, disappears entirely, and there is nothing but the water doing what it has done for 12,000 years, which is fall.